Good evening, everybody. And I want to thank Chad and the other members of the Buddhist Action Coalition, the regular group that meets, for inviting me to give this talk this evening. I gave the talk a rather maybe presumptuous title, Where Do We Go From Here? Following a long-range vision in an age of empty promises and instant expectations. But maybe I would retitle this, at least the subtitle, Following a Long-Range Positive Vision in an Age Approaching, in a time approaching system collapse. Perhaps that would be more appropriate to my intentions. And I want to begin by sort of highlighting some, what I call the symptoms of our dysfunctional social and economic system. And I don't actually like to overwhelm people with statistics, but I did compile a number of statistics, and I think I can share the screen. Is that correct? Um, yeah, so these were some statistics that I compiled for a talk actually about 2 years ago. And perhaps there have been some changes in the details, but I think the basic figures are fairly accurate, even though there might be some fluctuation up and down. But here I'm just focusing on inequality in the US. And some of these figures are rather shocking, that amongst the 10 most affluent countries, the US ranks last in terms of wealth inequality and income inequality. It is at the bottom in terms of safety net provisions that it offers poor families. It is among the lowest in the opportunities it offers low-income families to rise up from poverty. Among 21 countries, including most countries of Europe, in a composite index based on poverty, safety net provisions, and income inequality, the US ranked 18th, followed only by Spain, Estonia, and Greece. In 2017, the 400 wealthiest Americans own more wealth than the bottom 64% of the entire US population. And I think probably this year that income inequality has skewed even more, or this wealth inequality has skewed even more
Yeah.
towards the wealthiest Americans at the expense of those at the bottom. And in that year, America's 10 wealthiest men were collectively worth more than 633 billion. Perhaps today they're worth even more. Some figures indicating the extent of poverty in the US. This is in 2016. This is according to the official poverty measure. 12.5% of the US population were poor, and nearly 30% were low income. But there's another measure of poverty which is considered more adequate, and this is called the supplemental poverty measure. And on this standard, in 2016, 43.5% of the US population were either poor or low income. It's rather shocking. You know, when I lived for many years in Sri Lanka, and often people would come up to me and say, "What country are you from?" I would say, I'm come from America. And they would say, "America, very rich country." And I would have to say to them, and this was in the 1970s, 1980s, I would say, there's a lot of wealth in America, but don't think that that wealth is widely distributed. And this shows what the situation was like in 2016. And you could see that the distribution of poverty is more prevalent among Blacks and Latinos, though all segments of the population are caught up in poverty. 32 million people without health insurance. 40% of Americans have taken on debt because of medical issues. Student debt is just astronomical, affecting 44 million people. And it's a debt that will last a lifetime. One can never declare bankruptcy on account of student debt. Okay, so these are some figures which show the extent of income inequality, wealth inequality, and poverty in the United States. So this shows the economic dysfunction of our system. But there are other aspects of dysfunction, of our dysfunctional system, that have to be brought into the clear light of day. For one thing, we have continued to have racial tensions, systematic racism, which manifests in various ways. Perhaps the most shocking way is in the shocking and actually the almost debilitating number of cases of police shooting unarmed black people, particularly black males. That's something which is very common. Almost every week we read reports about this. Of course, it exploded this was late May, early June, with the murder of George Floyd. But killings like this go on almost weekly. And then beyond these shocking incidents of police violence against black people, particularly men, we have what's called the prison industrial complex, in which the United States has something like 4% of the world's population, but 25% of the world's prison population. And probably the great majority of prisoners are people of color. And then on top of economic inequality, this kind of social or racial injustice, we have accelerating climate change and environmental devastation. We have increasingly more intense hurricanes in the West Coast through the summer and fall. We had these terrible wildfires, which have burned up something like 3 million acres of wild forests. We have droughts, heat waves, and imperceptibly, there's the gradual increase in the global mean temperature or global average temperature, which is gradually causing the ice sheets, which maintain a stable climate, essential to a stable climate. They are melting, and we are all aware of what is going on. But despite the knowledge, despite the clear, indisputable, undeniable scientific evidence, the system, the economic system in which we move and live depends upon continued extraction, exploitation, and burning of fossil fuels, driving the climate ever closer to the edge of complete destabilization. Okay, so these are just some of the symptoms of what I call a dysfunctional social and economic system. So what kind of system should we be aiming for, particularly applying what I would call the standards of a Buddhist social conscience, in which we have to take the principles of the Dhamma, which have been laid down in the Buddhist texts from some 2,500 years ago, apply them to the present day, the underlying principles, and see what kind of social system, political system we should be aiming at today. And I would say, just as a first run through answer to that question, we should be aiming at to establish a healthy ecological system, to restore the regenerative capacity of the biosphere, and to protect that capacity from incursions that debilitate it and that drive it towards the edge of destruction. We should be, on the economic front, we should be aiming at a shared prosperity. We have the wealth to ensure that every person in this country and even globally will be able to live at a satisfactory standard, a sufficient standard of living for everyone to flourish and to fulfill their aspirations for economic well-being, rather than having this sharp divide between small, extremely wealthy elite and masses of people who are plunging ever more deeply into poverty. And then third, politically, we need an effective, functioning democracy with a government that represents all of us and that serves all of us, promoting social, economic, and political justice, and working actively to preserve the natural environment. So we need a healthy ecological system, a social justice, social and economic justice, and an effective, functioning political democracy. One perspective on the kind of ideal that we should be aiming for. Okay, I'm going to have to, I think, unshare and then reshare. I have this on another chart. This was a model developed by a British economist. Her name is Kate Raworth. She calls it donut economics because she has designed this donut figure showing what she calls the safe and just space for humanity. And so she has two components to create this donut. One is the environmental ceiling, which represents the points that we cannot overstep without causing widespread and lasting damage to the very life support systems that sustain us on this planet. And the other, at the bottom of the, or the inner ring of the donut, is the social foundation. This is the ceiling, this is the basement beneath which we cannot sink without accelerating social and economic injustice. So the environmental ceiling, if we surpass this, it will lead to intensified climate change, overuse of fresh water sources, ocean acidification of the oceans, chemical pollution, ozone depletion, loss of biodiversity, the destruction of the landscapes, and so forth. So those are just some of the aspects of the natural environment that we have to preserve. Then as the social foundation, she says, to create this safe and just space for humanity, we have to ensure that everybody has access to adequate food, water, income, a good education, a voice in their political system, good remunerative jobs, clean energy, social equity, gender equality, and healthcare. And she says, she writes, she has a book called Donut Economics and also a website from which I took down this diagram. And she speaks about, she raises the question, what enables human beings to thrive? She says it's a world in which every person can lead their life with dignity, opportunity, and community within the means of our life-giving planet. And so she has below the donut's social foundation like shortfalls in human well-being, that is the lack of food, education, and housing, and so forth. And beyond the ecological ceiling is the overshoot of pressure on the Earth's life-giving systems. That is through climate change, ocean acidification, and so on. And then she says, between these two boundaries is the sweet spot that is both the ecologically safe and socially just space for humanity. And she says that the task for us in the 21st century is to bring all of humanity into that safe space. where we have inclusive and sustainable economic development. And so she focuses on economic development because she's an economist. Yeah. In my own thinking, when I reflected on this question of what are the ideals that we should set for ourselves for the long range, is expressing a long range vision, what I did in sort of my own thinking was to delineate what I call 4 domains of value. And then to look at these 4 domains of value and to consider what is their true or intrinsic value and how the value of these domains, the true value of these domains, have become distorted and inverted under our present dominant economic and social system. And so I start with, at the foundation, with what I call the ecological sphere or the natural sphere. And that is that comprises 2 subsidiary systems, the geosphere, that is the sphere of inanimate nature, and the biosphere, the sphere of living nature. Together they form the ecological sphere. And the fundamental value in this sphere is their indispensable role in enabling life to persist and to flourish. This is the source of food, air, water, energy, all the raw materials that we use for buildings, medicines, clothes, trade, and so on. And this sphere has its intrinsic value, as we could say, of nourishing the human spirit by giving us a sense that we are rooted in a biosphere and in a cosmos that transcends human social conventions and institutions. But what happens under, let's say, the dominance of the corporate capitalist economy is that the natural sphere becomes commodified. That is, all of these natural resources become turned into resources for extraction, commercial production, and sale on the marketplace. So this leads to a desecration, or we could call this even a desacralization of the natural world. So everything is seen just for its capacity to be turned into monetary wealth. Okay, then the next domain of meaning or value is the social sphere, the systems that arise from human relationships and shared endeavors, the sphere where we launch our projects to achieve common purposes. And the inherent value of the social sphere is that this provides for human flourishing, for our protection, and it gives deeper fulfillment through community, through personal relationships, enabling us to pursue more effectively our own individual and collective aims. So it's within this sphere that we have political systems, the economy, social relationships, and so forth. Now, again, what happens to the value of this sphere when it undergoes the inversion is that people are changed from that perspective of the commercial culture. They are changed from being subjects of experience and members of a shared community. They are transformed into objects to be treated as workers, consumers, debtors, investors, partners. And through that inversion of value, the objectification of people, they become classified and categorized by way of race, ethnicity, religion, gender, and so forth. And what should be public goods, goods that should be shared by the larger community, become privatized through the corporate domination of the economy. And banks control the money systems, corporations control access to all of the goods that we require to flourish, and everything becomes sort of subordinated to the marketplace of production, sale, and consumption. Okay, so we have the ecological or natural sphere, the social sphere. The third domain is what I call the cultural sphere. And this is includes the various symbolic systems that deepen human consciousness through such things as the arts and literature, art, music, literature, things that enable us to enjoy life at a deeper level, to elevate our consciousness, to get glimpses of deep meaning in human existence, to enjoy the experience of the senses in a wholesome way. So that would be the true or intrinsic value of the cultural sphere. But again, under the system of corporate capitalism, the cultural or aesthetic sphere undergoes its inversion of value. So we have the corporate control of media, fostering the rise of celebrity culture, popular music in ever-changing fashions with ever-changing pop stars, and the corporate control over the popular musicians. Then we have the cults of movie stars, sports. Everything becomes dominated and controlled by the corporate culture. And so the cultural sphere just becomes a segment of the corporate capitalist economy, losing its capacity for elevating human consciousness to deeper and more sublime levels. Okay, then the fourth sphere of meaning is what I call the ultimate sphere. And this can be called maybe the sphere of liberating truth, the sphere of supreme goodness, the domain of our highest visions and aspirations, which gets expressed in human culture as religion and spiritual systems. And ideally, our involvement or participation in this sphere should lead to the deepest fulfillment, the attainment of the true ultimate aim of human existence. From a Buddhist perspective, this would be the attainment of nirvana or enlightenment, but each religion will have its own way of formulating its conception of the ultimate good. Okay, but through the inversion of value, the quest for the ultimate, for the deepest fulfillment, spiritual realization, also gets commercialized. And so we have, say, in American Christianity, we have the gospel of wealth, the theology of wealth, where Jesus taught that one should adopt a life of renunciation, of poverty. We now have the encouragement of people to acquire as much wealth as they can. And of course, to make very generous donations to support the mega churches, the giant mega churches. And with regard to the Eastern religions, we have kind of commercially packaged forms of spirituality, promising instant enlightenment, or the phenomena that's been called spiritual materialism. And what has happened to bring about this inversion, what I call the inversion of value, is that, okay, we have a proper, what I call a proper structure of value. Again, let me change the view with a new share. So this is what I call the proper ordering of values, where at the base we have the natural order or the ecological sphere, which serves as to provide material security and biological survival, the sphere of fundamental value. Then we have the social sphere, the sphere that provides, we call this human value, social and emotional fulfillment. The sphere of cultural value, which provides aesthetic and intellectual fulfillment. And then the sphere or domain of ultimate value, which should provide spiritual fulfillment. And we can see that these four domains rest one upon the other in this pyramid structure. Now, what has happened through the corporate dominance of our culture is that monetary value, let's say that money functions within these spheres, particularly emerging out of the social sphere, as a means of exchange for us to acquire the goods that we need and to sell the products of our labor. But perhaps at a certain stage in the evolution of capitalism, maybe 18th century, 19th century, money and monetary value has broken away from its proper role within the system and acquired almost a kind of independent value of its own, so that monetary value takes over the top position, and then it invades and colonizes the other domains, so that fundamental value or natural value turns nature into commodities. When monetary value invades the social sphere, it turns people into laborers, consumers, and debtors. When it invades the aesthetic sphere or cultural sphere, it leads to crass entertainment and anti-intellectualism. And when it invades the ultimate sphere, then it results in spiritual and religious materialism. Okay, now from here, I want to raise the question, what is it that sustains this dysfunctional system? When the system, we could say, is harmful to human well-being, when it deprives us of meaning and value in our lives, when it turns people, almost robbing them of their humanity, turning us just into workers who have to work our whole life, sometimes 10, 12 hours a day, 5 or 6 days a week, unable to find time to devote to any kind of other pursuits, struggling just to keep our employment, always anxious and fearful that we're going to lose our employment and fall into the ranks of the unemployed. Or if we are in the ranks of the unemployed, struggling to get out, and people put into constant competition with each other. So what is it that sustains this kind of dysfunctional system? So I've tried to develop my own analysis of this problem. And so I call this responding to the crises of our time. And I find that the core malady that underlies the great social, economic, and political and ecological challenges we're facing today is the dominance of unregulated or weakly regulated corporate capitalism, which is maintained by the doctrine of free market fundamentalism or neoliberal theory, neoliberal economic theory. So that serves as the justification for the system on the premise that the market knows best, government should stay out of the economic sphere, that if we leave the market to function according to its own laws, it's going to elevate all boats and that everybody will flourish through the unregulated market. Though we find that, in fact, when the market is left to its own, to run on its own momentum, the consequence is that a small number become extremely wealthy and the great numbers live a precarious existence from day to day. Okay, so the drivers of the system, of this corporate capitalist system, are the quest for expanding profits. Is sort of the inbuilt law of the corporation is that one has to continually increase the margin of profits. One has to provide through expanding profits. One provides higher, greater dividends for shareholders. One makes greater returns on financial investments, leading to increased capital accumulation. And this is to be accomplished by suppressing wages and benefits for workers, by forcing them into a situation where they're working as precarious contract labor with minimal benefits, and then by weakening or even abolishing regulations. And so this is why we're told that the best role for government is to stay out of the market. The government should not be imposing regulations on the market. And so we see that I think the promise of Donald Trump when he took over the presidency was that I'm going to eliminate for any new regulation, I'm going to abolish two existing regulations. Okay, then how, when the system is so pernicious and destructive, how is it maintained? How is it that we're not able to see through the system? So I say that the system is maintained by interlocking rings of institutions and relationships, which ensure that control over its operations remains in the hands of a privileged power elite, the plutocrats or the oligarchs, to ensure that their control is so firmly entrenched that it cannot be seriously challenged. And in this, I call this a matrix of domination. And within this matrix of domination, there are three rings to the system: the economic, the political, and the, call this the communicative media. So the economic ring consists of the corporate and financial class, the CEOs, financial managers, the big investors, billionaires and multimillionaires, the 1% or even the 0.1%. So these are the ones who are at the top of the system, the ones who exercise the maximum control. Okay, then we have the political ring to the system. And these are the government officials, representatives in all three branches of government who are expected to comply with the expectations and demands of the economic elite. So the political branch includes also the deep state that underlies changing administrations, which is committed to the project of maintaining US global military and political dominance to serve the interests and the needs of corporate capital. And so we could see the way the economic elite exercises its pressure on the political system, since when elections come around, the candidates for office depend upon contributions in order to be able to wage their campaign. And they get, or at least up until recently, they've all been getting their, at least the bulk of their contributions from the wealthy people who belong to the economic elite. And then the third component in this matrix of domination is the mainstream media, and increasingly certain branches of alternative media or social media. And so that this is the key to maintaining control over the system, since people's ways of viewing their lives, viewing their living situations, depends on the information they receive, the way they are conditioned to look at the world, to look at their lives, to look at their relationships to others within, and to view their place within the overarching system. And it is the media that ensures that voices of dissent are muffled, ridiculed, or relegated to the margins, so that they cannot capture a larger audience. So these are the three, what I call the three rings to the system: the economic, the political, and the information or the media. And then the internal relations between these components of the system are not symmetrical, but they're governed, the relationships are governed by the principle that ownership confers power. So those at the helm of the economic ring, that's the corporate and financial elite, exercise control over the other two rings, as I just mentioned. So they control the political system through campaign contributions, lobbying, pressure groups, and then by creating so-called think tanks that devise acceptable policy positions. And then they exercise control over the media, particularly the mainstream media, either through direct control or through advertising. Okay, so those are the three constituents or components in this matrix of domination. But there is an Achilles heel to the workings of this system, a kind of, maybe call it the fly in the soup or the thorn in the side of the system. Okay, on its own logic, on its own momentum, the system tends towards oligarchic control, towards plutocracy, or even autocracy. And in fact, we've been almost on the edge of autocracy over the past few years. Okay, so that is the tendency of the system, is towards plutocracy, and yet it must function within the boundaries of a legally, constitutionally defined democratic system of governance. So we have a group that's controlling the system whose interests are antithetical towards the interests of the greatest number of the population. And if the great majority of people truly understood their own interests, they would just sweep these oligarchs and plutocrats away and establish a truly economically and socially just system of governance. So how does this oligarchic elite maintain its control? How does it avoid the challenges to its dominance that might arise from public opinion and from concerted action to undermine its power? So it uses a number of strategies. So it's the task that it has to face is to prevent people from recognizing their common plight, from seeing that their troubles stem from a dysfunctional system, and they must be prevented from recognizing that they are capable of unifying and acting to promote their genuine interests. So the system must prevent the emergence of any unified movement of people standing together to challenge the dominance of this dysfunctional system and seeking more equitable and more compassionate alternatives. And so the way to do this is to prevent a shared recognition of unity from emerging. And there are various strategies that are used to do this. So, but what all of them have in common is to create divisions between people whose interests overlap much more than the divisions that are planted in their minds by the, call this the propaganda of those at the head of the system. And so the strategists of the system create divisions. One way is by emphasizing issues of identity over that of common interest, splintering people by way of their personal identities. So in this way, the system will encourage, or even in subtle ways, racism, so pitting white working class against Black working class, pitting citizens of the US against immigrants who come to work here, pitting people of different religions against each other, Christians against Jews and Muslims, pitting the real Americans against those, this was Salin Paler's expression, the real Americans against those people living in the so-called dysfunctional cities, the corrupt, decaying cities, who are considered not to be real Americans. So that's one kind of strategy that's used. Another strategy is to encourage a kind of extreme individualism, promoting an attitude of competitiveness, consumerism, resentment against minorities, stirring up resentment against other countries. And so at present now, China becomes the bad guy, Iran is the bad guy, and then to mobilize people against the other countries, we have to stir up a sense of patriotism, religious fervor, and so forth. So in this way, though people are being thrown or plunged into poverty, debt, and social marginalization, these problems are being overlaid by either creation of artificial divisions or stirring up unity through this false sense of patriotism and militarism. Yeah. I wanted to leave some time for questions. So what I would say is that our task sort of as progressive social activists is to overcome that artificial sense of division that is being created through the propaganda of those in the positions, entrenched positions of power and wealth to divide us from each other, by recognizing that the system itself is dysfunctional in many different dimensions, many different aspects. And to be effective in resisting the system, it's necessary to break out from a kind of silo mentality by which we become focused just on individual issues and rather say that the system itself is a kind of overarching system of domination, which it's malfunctioning in many different respects, that we have to come together in unity in order to resist. So this means that we have to address the malfunctioning of the system in economic terms, ecological terms, political terms, social terms, promoting economic justice, racial justice, gender equality, and ecological sustainability, and push for a genuine system of true democracy. And I lay down some kind of guidelines in my own way of thinking, what I call steps to system transformation, practical steps towards system transformation. A lot of this is utopian thinking, I have to confess, but it's through utopian thinking that we set the ideals that we should posit for ourselves. And it's these utopian ideals that motivate us to take action at simpler and more practical level to bring about gradual transformations in the dominant system. So one essential step is to move to new models of ownership. And this follows from the principle that I mentioned earlier, the principle that ownership confers power. And it's the ownership of the means of production and control over financial assets that creates political power. And so from this, it follows that in order to establish true political democracy, we have to start with greater economic democracy. And that means that for the very survival even of humanity and of preservation of the ecological integrity of this planet, we have to move away from the dominant model of corporate capitalism towards a new model of ownership characterized by shared wealth and a more equitable distribution of wealth. And this could be a model in which large industries and enterprises are administered by a system of worker ownership and worker management. And the profits generated by the company or by the firm are shared among the workforce in a more equitable way than occurs at present. Already such forms of ownership are starting to emerge in the United States, though still on a small scale. So we have worker-owned enterprises, worker self-directed enterprises, whereby the workers not only own the enterprise, but also appoint their own board of directors and board of managers. Yeah, some of these, the outlines of the system have been described by some of the economic thinkers, Gar Alperovitz, in his book called America Beyond Capitalism, the economist Richard Wolff in his book called Democracy at Work. And a system like this will give greater worker control over their own workplaces so that workers determine which goods are needed and whether these goods make a positive social contribution or just feed consumerist craving. And companies can also be held to a test of social and environmental responsibility. So their performance would be reviewed every few years by an outside panel that will determine whether they are playing a socially constructive role and are not exerting a destructive impact on the natural environment. And only when they meet that test should their charters be renewed. Okay, another idea that can serve as a guidepost towards the emergence of a new economy, and that is the setting as our goal not a growth economy, but a steady state or net zero growth economy. This is one model that's been proposed. So our present economy, our capitalist economy, I describe it as being rooted in an addiction to abstractions. So first, the economy itself is abstracted from its place within the total framework of the social order. So that's the first level of abstraction. And then economic well-being is determined purely by monetary figures, by the total value of production, services, and consumption. And this is what leads to a dysfunctional economic order in which there is glaring disparities of wealth, where we have a small sliver of super wealthy people and a huge base of people living sometimes at the threshold of survival, barely getting by from day to day. So instead of using this figure of gross domestic product to determine the health of the economy, we can measure economic health by seeing whether all people are being provided with adequate food, clothing, shelter, healthcare, education, and so forth. So instead of using the gross domestic product, we could be using a number of other criteria that would together constitute a measure of gross national happiness. And then what is of the prime importance is to make the transition to a green economy, moving away from our dependence on fossil fuels to the use of green and renewable, clean and renewable sources of energy. But this shift to green sources of energy has to include has to be a just transition by which displaced workers are trained to acquire the skills they need to fit into the new green economy. In fact, this is what leads to almost a kind of stalemate in the present, our efforts to change the present political system, where when proposals are made to shift over to a green economy, then those who are vying for positions of power in the elections say, well, if you're going to change away from fossil fuels to green sources of energy, then you're going to lead millions of workers are going to lose their job, and then they'll be thrown into the ranks of the unemployed. And in this way, the politicians mobilize workers in the energy sector to support regressive policies rather than the transition to a progressive economic system. Okay, so these are what I call some guideposts to the transition to a new economy, but then we come across the stumbling blocks to this transition, the big stumbling blocks. What are the big stumbling blocks that we face? And sadly, I have to say the biggest stumbling block is the American political system. And I just will briefly mention some of these features of the American political system, which impede all of our efforts and aspirations to establish the new, benign, life-promoting economic and social system. This includes, okay, the electoral college system, which gives disproportionate power to the voters in the swing states or the battleground states over voters in other states, and enables a candidate who loses the popular vote to win the presidency by gathering enough electoral votes in the electoral college. Then the political system now has been using voter suppression so that Republican majorities have been making it harder for people to vote, especially minorities, using various strategies to deprive people of the vote. The Senate is another roadblock on the way to transformation, since according to the Constitution, each state has 2 senators. So this gives a disproportionate amount of political power to small, conservative, rural states over the heavily populated states along the coasts with diverse urban populations. And so because of this system of the Senate, Democrats might represent millions of more people, and yet their states have 2 senators, just like Wyoming, Idaho, or Nebraska, with their small populations. Then we have the system of judicial appointments, where the judicial appointment can last a lifetime, and where the judges appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate can have final say over the legitimacy of legislation. And so the judiciary can shape the future destiny of our country for decades, even when the judgments of the judiciary are contrary to the will of the overwhelming majority of people. Okay, so these are some of the deformations in our political system, which several of them are already embedded in the Constitution. And why, we've had these deformations present in our political system for centuries, but the question came to my mind, why have they become so destructive and harmful over the past 20 years? In my assessment, this is because of the rise of the new media conglomerates and social media platforms that have free rein to propagate falsehoods and deceptions and to deliberately inflame partisan rage, particularly in an economic system which excludes masses of people from a viable standard of living, in order to prevent people from seeing the true source of their misery in the contours of the system. Instead, the media inflame their antagonism towards minorities, foreigners, immigrants, and so forth. And so we have the commentators on Fox, and I have to confess, I never really watched them. I only see, occasionally I see small video clips of them, which is enough for me. We have these commentators like Hannity, Tucker Carlson, Laura Ingraham. Then there are some newer news websites, Newsmax, One American News, Breitbart, and then Facebook and Twitter allow falsehoods and conspiracy theories to propagate through the ecosphere, fueling hatred and serving the lust for power of those at the control, holding the controls of the system. So this is what we are up against, and what we have to marshal to stand up against this dominant system are the values that sustain us, particularly for those of us who are followers of the Buddha Dharma. I've tried to lay out just a few guiding values, which are basically the values laid out in the formation of BAC, the Buddhist Action Coalition. So I mentioned here discernment, which I call a clear and deep understanding of the disabling social and political forces at work in our society, a vision that should extend horizontally to embrace all humanity and vertically down to future generations. Second, we need a sense of solidarity, a recognition of the essential unity of all people, rooted in the understanding that all human beings equally seek to be well, happy, and free from suffering. The sense of solidarity manifests on the one hand as love or loving kindness, the action to promote the well-being, safety, and happiness of others, and as compassion, the imperative to alleviate the suffering of others and to address the causes of suffering. Fifth, I have justice, a sense of social, political, and legal justice based on the principle that all people should be treated fairly and be free to shape the institutions that govern their lives. Then equity, the conviction that all people should receive an adequate share of the material resources of life. Seventh, I have peace, promoting peaceful solutions to communal, national, and global problems. And eighth, I have responsibility, by which I mean the willingness to act on behalf of people in need, including future generations, and on behalf of a living planet. Okay, so maybe this can do for my presentation, and maybe in the time remaining, we can take some questions. And I think maybe an easy way to deal with the questions, I believe that if you open the participant box in Zoom, you'll see at the bottom a hand symbol for raising the hand. And then if you click that symbol, then I will see you raise your hand, and then I'll be able to call on you and take your question. Okay, I see the first hand symbol I see is Jenny O.
Hi, Bhante. This is Jenny.
Oh, it's
Can
Jenny
you hear
O.
me?
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I can hear.
Hello. You gave a lot of great suggestions, particularly the cooperative worker ownership suggestion, which, as far as I know, tends to take place right now in terms of commodity industries. But I personally work in sort of lesser industries, more like lifestyle industries, products like that have to do with consumer lifestyles. And in that arena, I keep thinking to myself that making a difference in that arena, people can make more conscious consumer choices. And that would be a way to make a difference in changing consumer demand.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely.
So I just wanted to put that forth because the cooperative worker ownership situation seems to only occur in unionized situations with commodity industries. Thank you so much for the talk tonight.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Yeah, that's a good suggestion. And the information that I got about these worker-owned and worker-managed industries, the two books that I relied on to get this information, Gar Alperovitz, I wonder if I could type his name someplace, if there's the chat box, that will work. I think that's the spelling, but if you search for the name, if I spelled it a little wrong, it'll give you the correct spelling. His book is called first book is called America Beyond Capitalism. And there's a second book. I don't remember the title of it. Um, yeah, I'd have to go searching for the title. And then the other book is by Richard Wolff called Democracy at Work, in which he lays out in detail the sort of design features of these worker managed enterprises. Perhaps he deals with other types of industries besides commodity productive enterprises in that book. I don't remember the details of the book. Okay, do we have any? Yeah, when you finish speaking, then what you do is lower the hand. Otherwise, I'll think that you still have a question. Okay, so I see Kenneth Abro.
Yes, Bante. Priyanka, my wife, actually has a question. Go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, good evening, Bante. So, what you were saying about the lies and the mistruth that's printed in various media outlets such as Breitbart and Fox News. So how can we as common people try to correct that? Because obviously this is a country divided, right? And this is fueled by this misinformation. So can we take any practical steps as individuals?
I don't think that as individuals we have a way to stop the commentators on Fox News from broadcasting their messages. They're going to go on broadcasting, but there's very little that we could do. Fortunately, I think at least Twitter, which I don't use, but what I've heard is that they are labeling misleading messages, and if the message is complete falsehood, they're removing it from the Twitter boxes. And I think Facebook has been more remiss in this, but I think there's increasing pressure on Facebook to take more responsibility over the messages that come over on Facebook. But what I would say is that we could gain better understanding of what is taking place in our political and social system by relying more on really reliable alternative media sources, which provide information that you don't even find on the more conservative or the more mainstream reliable media outlets. So the places where I go to get my information, primarily for a video presentation, I go to Democracy Now! With Amy Goodman, which you can get. You don't have to watch it live. You could get it over the recordings of it, and you can get it over YouTube, the segments over YouTube. And I go also to the website Common Dreams, which is a kind of amalgamation of many articles. I see somebody put up Gar Alparovitz. Yeah, I got the spelling a little bit wrong, but.
Did you say it's Common Reads or Common
Dreams, like dreaming.
Okay.
Common Dreams. Truth Out is also good. So Democracy Now!, Common Dreams, Truth Out. There are still more, but those should give you quite a lot of information.
Thank you.
Okay, I see James. You
Yes,
can
hello, Bhante. Good evening.
I say that's James Cook.
Oh, yes. Hello. And Pamela as well.
Are you married now?
Not yet.
Okay.
We'll let the Buddhist Action Coalition know that when that action is happening. But actually, I was wondering if you could speak briefly to taking these 8 sort of distinct, I don't even know the term for it, but what you just mentioned, into how do we form that using the Buddhist Action Coalition into actionable steps, organizing these into something that we can do as a group?
Well, the Buddhist Action Coalition has taken action on different issues. Like last year, there were marches on behalf of the climate, joining the climate marches. There have been marches against gun violence. I think marches against racial injustice and police brutality. Since many of the activities take place in New York City, and I'm not in New York City, so it's a little difficult for me to participate directly. But you can go just to the website. Now activity has to be a little bit hampered because we have the COVID pandemic preventing more explicit types of overt action.
Well, it just seems to me these are great guidelines, as you say, to drive the action specifically to
Yeah.
some of the political
Yeah.
activities and corporate people developing new companies, maybe kind of organizing the ideas in ways that a new developing company, for example, could make it employee owned as per these books, etc.
Yeah, and what I should mention is that the way so many of these issues that we deal with and face, these problems that we confront, are intricately interwoven. And one organization, much more extensive and powerful than Buddhist Action Coalition, which has seen it's called the intersectional or overlapping or integrated nature of these challenges we're facing, is the Poor People's Campaign. Even though it has the title Poor People's Campaign, so from the name of the organization, you think it's concerned only with poverty, but that's not the case. It sees the interwoven, intersecting nature of poverty here in the United States and globally, together with systemic racism, together with militarism, by which and this is something that persists from one administration to the next, Democrat or Republican, some of the discretionary budget. This is a rather shocking figure, but I think it's more than half of the discretionary budget goes to military purposes. So currently, I think it's something like more than $700 billion is spent on the military directly. And then there are all sorts of under the cover military expenses. So when you total them all together, it's probably about $1 trillion in the economy going to military purposes, directly or indirectly. And it would take just a small fraction of that, to provide healthcare, decent healthcare to every American. To eliminate hunger in the United States would take something like $20 billion, small fraction. I got a little off track. So we have poverty, racism, militarism, and environmental destruction, including climate change. Again, it would take a small fraction of that military budget to make the transition entirely to a green energy economy and providing job training to all the workers who would be displaced by the transition to a green economy. Just a fraction of that amount. Okay, Tom Griffin.
Yeah, well, I wrote my question in the chat also. I said I may have missed it, but I didn't hear any discussion of our democratic system as a way of governing that is in accord with Buddhist principles, basically the value of each human being or being. I agree, and many others feel that democracy is in danger of being suppressed by autocracy. Yes, I agree. We all agree. Many people agree. But don't you think that people who value democracy, therefore, need to work much harder to preserve it in democratic activities, like volunteering on a campaign, not just voting?
Yeah.
Voting is a bare minimum. But
yeah.
Educating people as to the issues, as you just laid out in this whole course, but going out and telling people this stuff face to face, person to person.
Yeah, definitely.
Otherwise, how are they going to know? They're not going to learn it from most of the media.
Yeah.
So I actually ended up feeling your comments present a dark and seemingly hopeless view that it's too late to save democracy. Have I misunderstood you, I hope?
I certainly didn't want to say that it's too late and to present an extremely dark picture and saying that it's too late to preserve democracy. I say that there are glimmers of hope, but we really have to act and act in concert and act over a range of issues to preserve democracy. That it's not enough just to go out every 2 years or every 4 years to vote. But democracy has to build up, I would say, even from the grassroots up. And so we have to focus attention not only on the presidential campaign, but also on congressional campaigns, and perhaps even the congressional campaigns in the House of Representatives is a more effective way to putting pressure on the presidential administration to respond to the needs of the people. But what I would say is that educating people by presenting them with accurate information is the most essential key to preserving democracy. But I think in increasing numbers of people, maybe particularly in urban areas or areas which have been subjected to, which have access to more progressive information, are coming to recognize the intersecting nature of the issues and to see our ability by functioning together, by acting together to transform the political system. But it's really going to be a very, very hard fight. And I say that I don't want to fall into a dark picture. I also don't want to draw an overly bright and rosy picture, because those forces of oligarchic and plutocratic control are quite, I'll have to use the word ruthless.
Yeah, right.
In their intentions.
Okay, well, thank you.
I saw some people over the internet saying, now we have to all come together under the aegis of kindness and mindfulness, and everything will be hunky-dory. No, we have to really work for, I say, justice in every domain: economic, political, social, racial, environmental justice.
Chad Deshant asked me to say to you that he got an anonymous question that he would like to ask you now.
Okay.
Yes. Hi, Bhante. It came in at the very beginning, so to be fair, I wanted to get it in here. So it was related, but it's somebody wants to know from a personal perspective, what do you think people in the U.S. should be doing? And he has some suggestions, and I guess he wants your opinion on these.
Are you listening?
So vegetarianism, material renunciation, making money to give it away, or running for political office. Would you recommend any of those?
Wait, say that, but I didn't quite catch.
Oh, sorry. So he wanted to know whether you'd recommend vegetarianism, material renunciation, making as much money as possible in order to give it away, and running for political office. Are these things that you would recommend? Somebody wants to know.
Let's go through them one by one. Veganism or vegetarianism, of course, is very good in its own right, in that it makes a positive contribution to preserving resources, to protecting animal life, to reducing carbon emissions. In itself, it's not a complete solution. It's one contributing factor. Though I don't want to criticize people who are not vegetarian, but we certainly have to steer the food system away from the heavy reliance on meat, on meat-based diet. Okay, the next one was renunciation.
Yes, material renunciation.
Material. I would say, of course, not everybody can become a monk, but if anybody would like to, we have some rooms in the monastery. Yeah, so not everybody can take the full step of renunciation that a monastic will take, but certainly we have to turn away from a consumerist culture to other and deeper sources of enjoyment and fulfillment, apart from, you know, the continual need to purchase more and more material goods, which is one of the factors that sustains the corporate-based economy, always changing styles, fashions, models, so that we get one model, the next year we have to throw it away, we'll give it away and replace it with the next model. Okay, earning a lot of money and giving it away in charity. I mean, that's good in itself, but it's not going to transform the dominant system. Running for office, of course, to run for office, if you have that charisma, that ability, the financial support, and the ideals and motivation, do so. But very, very few people will have all of those resources. But what one can do is to align oneself with, I would say, as a progressive myself, align oneself with progressive politicians and support their campaigns in the ways that Tom suggested a few minutes ago. Okay, HD Meyer.
Yeah, hi. Thank you, Bhante, for the talk. I'm left a little bewildered. With your analysis about, there are these groups at the apex that indoctrinate and create dissension among people. I agree with it at one level, but as a Buddhist, am I not? Isn't what we are seeing at some fundamental level simply defilements at work, greed, anger, delusion? That yes, it's reaching system-threatening, survival-threatening proportions, but it has is if we take the 2,500-year look, do you think we are at a singularly unique point, or has mankind been here? And as a Buddhist, my impression of the Buddha's teaching, yes, he taught about social and communal harmony. You have a very good book on that. But hasn't he also taught that we sort of find work for our liberation under any social conditions? And that when there is an alternative between activism and working on one's liberation, that the latter is primary. Maybe I'm misconstruing things, and maybe I'm very pessimistic as to this 70 million who voted for somebody who's a liar. So I feel deflated after this election, and I feel more like heading for the monastery than heading into the streets and being an activist, to be honest.
So I don't see the two as being inherently mutually exclusive. Of course, some people might want to devote themselves fully to the work of personal liberation, but that was sort of maybe the path that I was following decades ago. But after I came back to the United States and then had greater access to information about what is going on in the world and what is taking place in this country, I came to feel in my own mind the need to also take on a greater sense of, I call it a greater sense of social conscience, or expressing compassion in conscientious action, while at the same time not neglecting the work of inner development. And as for the defilements being present throughout the entirety of humanity's history, yes, that's true. But what I would say is that today, because of maybe the unification of the world into one intricately interconnected global system, and with the means of technological innovation, greed, hatred, and ignorance, and conceit, and ambition, competitiveness have become much more, their destructive potential has been greatly amplified by all of those resources. Okay, I see Gita.
Hi, Bhikkhu Bodhi. Thank you very much for your time and teaching. I agree wholeheartedly with all of your analysis and advice, but in order to reach a population shift in political ideals, I believe society needs to reorient from the nurtured and normative desires of acquiring wealth and monetary gain for oneself to having compassion for all beings and striving towards having a just and equal society. However, how is it possible to change these deeply ingrained beliefs at large when they are permeating every day from media, politics, etc.? How can greed be uprooted and replaced with compassion?
And that's Tanoja, by the way.
Thanks.
Oh, that's what I see. That's she's your granddaughter?
No.
Daughter.
She's your daughter, okay, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. One thing that's thought that lingers in the back of my mind is the American educational system. Why can't we have courses starting from even from elementary school, but especially high school, middle school or high school, courses in ethics and civics for students, or even courses in world religions for high school students. Of course, that becomes a little sensitive because people adherents of one religion, particularly evangelical Christianity, would think that they alone have the correct religion, that everything else is heresy. But if children at least are taught courses in ethics, both secular and religious ethics, that will implant in their minds from a young age an appreciation for these great moral values that could then shape their ways of thinking when they come to adulthood. At least that's one proposal that I would make to dealing with that question.
The Dalai Lama has a campaign on that.
Excuse me?
The Dalai Lama has a campaign on educating the heart that
Yeah. In fact, he has the book called Secular Ethics. Okay, and then let's take Dorothea.
Hi, Bhante. How are you?
Hi.
Good to see you.
Yeah, good to see you.
So good to see you. Thank you so much for this presentation. I'm actually going to read from the chat. Somebody put in a really good question, I think. But before I do, Bhante, I want to share a quote just to follow up on the young woman who said something about how can we do this? How can we?
Yeah. Okay, good.
Yeah. So from Margaret Mead, she said, never doubt, this is about anti-slavery in Britain a long time ago. Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has.
Yeah.
So we all have agency, however little that we can do. I think we need to start from that thinking that we have the agency.
Yeah, exactly.
So the question, I'm sorry, is from Jason Fenn, who's been to a couple of Buddhist Action Coalition. So Jason, I'm going to read your question here, okay? So what lessons do you think we can draw from previous historical examples of imperial collapse to help guide how much energy should be invested in reform of overarching national and global institutions, as opposed to more local, horizontal efforts to divest and collectivize resources? For example, worker co-ops for food sovereignty and collective security.
Can I? Does anybody have any ideas about this? Maybe Jason, you have some ideas about this.
I guess.
Want to share?
Thank you for the opportunity. My thought is that it's too late to reform these systems, far too late. That the collapse has a gravity that we can't countermand. And I truly believe that our energy should be placed in collective security arrangements and food sovereignty arrangements, which are highly focused on people who particularly bear the brunt of our economy. So what I mean by that is that I think that our economy is in the process of abandoning those people even more thoroughly than previously, and that many of us who thought themselves somewhat immune from those forces will find themselves wrapped up in the abandonment due to what looks to be a new depression as the trillions of the CARES Act secure Wall Street from the consequences of the real economy. So I guess what I'm advocating here in the question is that we focus less on how we may overarchingly influence the democratic reform and more on how we may immediately collaborate in security as the collapse unfolds seemingly ineluctably. That is my position, and I'm curious what your historical or other analysis might be able to either, countermand that point or point toward futures of collective arrangements through horizontal mutual aid that Buddhism might particularly have a position about.
I don't see these two alternatives that you laid down as being necessarily mutually exclusive. The individuals might want to function, to devote more effort and time to one rather than to the other. I think definitely I would say that the system, the overarching system, is tending towards some kind of, I don't want to say complete collapse, but it's crashing down upon itself. And I think as it crashes, it could awaken in increasing numbers of people the recognition that we have to do something to utterly transform this overarching system. And in fact, I think already increasing numbers of people have that consciousness, particularly, I would say, as climate change accelerates and becomes more fierce and more destructive in its impacts. But I don't think that devotion towards change at the more comprehensive level necessarily excludes acting effectively at the what you call the local and horizontal effort to collectivize resources. But this is an area where I have to say I don't really have expertise. In fact, very little that I said today is an area where I have expertise. It's just thoughts that have come out from my reading and reflection.
Thank you.
Okay, I see there's a Beth who I don't think spoke yet, so. Beth, did you want to unmute? Oh yeah, okay, now you. I think you're still. No, I'm not getting any sound. If you want, I'll call on somebody else and you can type your question into the chat box. James, did you have another comment or question?
Yes, I'll make it really quick. Actually, I think it might be in reference to HT's comment about the power, sort of the power structure. And I'm sorry if I got that wrong, but I just want to make a real point about there's a software developer named Jaron Lanier who was very heavily responsible for virtual reality. And he's asserting that the sort of where we come from, the George Orwellian idea that there's somebody controlling at the top, this sort of machinery, which is true. We know the oligarchy and the economic power is just out of control. It's really a monarchy, almost in a sense. But that mechanically it's built into the system. If you're on Facebook and the algorithms are not programmed intentionally to promote evil, but they reward the evil impulse. You're angry at it as opposed to you click on it. And that's what happens is so the algorithm teaches itself to respond to the negative impulses. So that's something I'm just trying to be inspirational in the sense that we have to consciously fight that. We can't, that's all I was going to say.
And did Beth, I don't think she typed her question.
No, and we've gone over our time, so
Yeah,
it might be a good time to end.
Okay.
Do you have any concluding comments, or?
I would just say that we have to really work together, particularly those of us who are Buddhists. I call this conscientious compassion, that it's not enough just to keep the compassion as an inward meditative state or a beautiful ideal, but we have to, with a sense of conscience, we have to put it into action by working, I would say, at various levels according to our capacity to transform, whether at the local level or at the overarching level, to transform the system in which we're living, each according to our own capacity. But one excellent book that I just, in preparing for this talk, that I just read over the past week, that I want to recommend, we just reach for it. It sort of lays out the ground plan for a comprehensive systemic transformation. It's called Welcome to the Revolution by Charles Derber. I'll write his name in. Welcome to the Revolution, universalizing resistance for social justice and democracy in perilous times. A revolutionary progressive strategy for the Trump era and beyond. Well, hopefully in a few more weeks, actually it's too long, 2 more months will be beyond. Okay, so again, thank you for hosting this, and thank you all for joining.
Thank you very much. And just to let everybody know, this is the second in a series that BAC is doing. And so please sign up for our listserv and you'll be notified about our next events. So thank you again, Bhante.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.